So welcome everyone to another webinar for the National Alliance. We actually have a really busy week this week. We have Dr. Sam MacDonald and Dominique Gaulin with us. And Dominique, I hope I'm saying your last name correct, am I? Gaulin?
Yeah.
Perfect. Tomorrow we have international perspectives on homelessness, rural homelessness from Northern Ireland and Scotland tomorrow on a webinar, which is I'm really looking forward to as well. And then on Thursday, we actually have started a new national community of practice for the National Alliance. So folks who are working frontline, who want to engage with other professionals from across the country to share ideas, program ideas, challenges, problems. That'll be on Thursday as well. And that's the first this year of that community practice, which will be meeting every 3 months as well. So we appreciate it when folks like Dr. MacDonald and Dominic can come on and talk about their projects, because one of the things the National Alliance is focused on, and I see we have like Rebecca with us as well, who's another researcher we're working with. We're really grateful for the limited amount of researchers across the country who are actually doing rural research. It's a small sort of pod of people who've focused on rural projects. So we're highly grateful for that when we see these projects come out, because it's such a, in my opinion, as an advocate for rural and remote communities, a neglected topic. And it's one of the challenges that we've had as a National Alliance in advocating for rural communities to have research and data to back up what we're saying. There's lots of people who've been doing work on the ground level in rural communities across the country for years, but to have evidence of it is really important when it comes to advocating for resources. So we're grateful to all of you researchers on the call today. For those of you who don't know, the National Alliance was set up about 2 years ago. Actually, we had started, and really what we did was pull together a group of individuals, agencies, communities together from across the country, and wanted to start elevating the conversation around rural road homelessness. The limited research that does exist in Canada and the US shows that rural homelessness is just as prevalent in rural communities as it is in urban centers, if not higher. And we know other well-researched topics like domestic violence, for example, show much higher rates in rural and remote communities sometimes too. So it's really important that we actually talk about this, because if we're not allocating the appropriate resources and funds to the topic, then it makes it really challenging for rural communities to actually address housing and homelessness. So it's certainly not just an urban issue, and we need to start changing the dialogue around that. So our mission is just to help rural and remote communities right across the country get the resources that they need, whether it's actual tools and toolkits like the Housing First toolkit we're working on right now, or funding to actually address housing and homelessness in their communities. So, oops. So it's also extremely important for us, specifically when we're talking rural remote as well, because a large proportion of the population is Indigenous in rural remote communities. So we want to always acknowledge the lands that we're on. And because we're in a virtual platform, I want to take a moment just to acknowledge the importance of lands, which we all call home. And in these types of webinars, we're in places right across the country. So, and we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. And again, so because we're all coast to coast to coast right now in calls like this, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people that we call home, that we call this land home. And for me specifically, because I'm in Lanark County, we're actually on Algonquin territory here in Lanark County. So. And then just a quick run through the agenda, introductions. I'm actually going to pass it off to Sue-Ann and Dominique to actually introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their research project, but also what they're working on, where they're from, what university. Michelle, I should mention Michelle Balick is on this call as well. Michelle is always running backup and admin for us and social media promotion and all kinds of stuff that she does for the Canadian Alliance. So we really appreciate her support. She's always on here to back us up. So we are going to do a question and answer and leave some room for questions and answers at the end. Dr. MacDonald and Dominique think their presentation will be about 45 minutes. So we will leave about 10 minutes at the end. So please, as you go as they're presenting, feel free to type in any questions you have in the chat box or the Q&A answer box, and then we'll refer to those back at the end of the presentation. We were going to allow questions throughout, but we were just a little concerned about timing. So we really want them to be able to get through their presentation. So, but by all means, type in your questions and we'll get to them at the end. And in terms of a closing, I'm just going to simply say now, actually, so we can leave as much time as possible to Q&A, that if you're looking for any of the upcoming webinars, to register for those, just go to the website, the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness website. You can find all the community practice dates and all the webinars coming up on there, and you can register there. And we also have a membership list. So if you sign up for the membership list, you'll automatically get links and notes about upcoming webinars. So you can also join there too. So, and I'm now going to pass it over on that note to Dr. Sam MacDonald and Dominique. So over to you.
Thanks, Terry Lee. So my name is MacDonald. No doctor, please. I'm not the person that's really into the status and labels and such, especially considering the nature of our presentation today. But Dominique and I are coming to you from Montreal. Dominique, I'll let you present yourself maybe quickly as well. So I've been in Montreal for about 9 years. I'm at the University of Montreal in the School of Social Work, but I've been working on, in and around homelessness for over 20 years. With first experiences in Toronto. And in fact, Michael Shapcott, I think I was at some meetings back when I was a Master of Social Work student in Toronto at the end of the 90s, and where I had first experiences up close with doing outreach with Regent Park Community Health Center and things like that. So, and then from there, I was in Ottawa for 10 years, working as well on a mental health outreach team while I was doing my PhD at University of Montreal. So, these issues are very close to my heart, close to my practice heart as well. And really this project that we're presenting today it was kind of a first project we did that Terry Lee came across. But since then, I'll elaborate on that later, but since then we've actually conducted other projects on rural and semi-rural homelessness. Dominique, why don't you present yourself quickly as well while we're in the presentation?
Hi, so I'm Dominique Gaulin. I'm a social worker and a PhD candidate working with Sue and MacDonald for almost 10 years. So my research project are around homelessness. And this project was actually my first one with Sue, so it's really nice to be presenting it today. And my other field of research is Indigenous mental health. So I mostly work in Nunavik and a little bit in Montreal too. So it's really nice to be with you today and presenting this project.
Thanks, Dominique. So yeah, thanks again to the Alliance for inviting us. And this came about really because Terry Lee came across an article that we had published in the Journal of Social Distress and Homelessness on the invisibility of rural homelessness. Sorry, I have something in my throat. And we have that reference at the end of our presentation if you want to read that article and know what we're presenting about, because I'm going to go pretty summarily into the presentation. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure, apologize for the coughing. This is called a fatigue cough, and having children at home that could appear at any moment in the background. So I don't know who's joining us that are based in Quebec, but I feel like it's really important to mention how homelessness is perceived, conceived, understood in Quebec. To explain the nature of our project. So in 2014, 2015, the Quebec government adopted a definition. They produced the first national policy on homelessness, which then produced an action plan for the province. And really the definition of homelessness was understood as one of social disaffiliation, social rupture. So not just not having a home, not having a house, not having permanent housing, but really the idea that homelessness is the result of a combination of individual, structural, systemic factors that make it very difficult for people to exercise their citizenship. So I feel it's important to mention because I think these elements of social rupture, social disaffiliation, being socially excluded, really speak to the local actors we work with, really speak to their understanding of homelessness as well, and this kind of larger portrait of the experience of homelessness. And we also know that, as Terry Lee mentioned, homelessness is a changing portrait, long associated with urban environments, but this is really in fact changing, and we've had some really great research come out about hidden homelessness. And I think that the research we've done in Quebec so far, which we will draw on, some of which we'll draw on today, is really about the hidden homelessness piece. So the piece of homelessness we don't see, and that the typical classic images we have of Skid Row, the hobo, and those kinds of images don't really correspond to the experiences of homelessness in rural and semi-rural environments. Next slide, please. So this was a rather small project in 2015 that actually came to us, was a request of a local organization, a local Center for Community Development. Sorry, all the research was in French, so when I do the translation, I have to kind of place things correspondingly. So we were asked to carry out this research by a small group of actors in the territory. This region is about an hour from Montreal. So it's south of Montreal. So parts of the region are actually quite close to Montreal. So there's kind of a, which is not the region where we really carried out the research in, but it's important to understand that some of the region is kind of considered a bedroom community to Montreal. So there are things like gentrification and demands on housing stock that are important to consider. Our research was in the more rural and semi-rural part of this region called Montérégie. And like I said, we were asked by this local community center for development to develop the project. And really what they wanted to know, they felt that there was an increase in people experiencing homelessness. They didn't have any evidence to support those claims. They also felt there was very little recognition at the municipal level that people were experiencing homelessness. So there was really also a political intention behind the research. And they really were hoping that we could describe the scale and scope of homelessness in the region. And document the diversity of the realities and perceptions of homelessness by really answering the question, what does homelessness look like in our region? And also by uncovering what supports and services existed to respond to homelessness, but also the obstacles encountered in those services and resources. And thirdly, they wanted to really create an awareness about the invisibility of homelessness and support the development of a community action plan, which they did pursue at the end of the research. Next slide, please. And it's important to mention these pieces because when we were first contacted, or when I was first contacted by the local actors, there was really an intention that they wanted to do a point in time count. They wanted to kind of do a scan and see who's experiencing homelessness. But rapidly, we realized that this was rather impossible. For one, because it's a pretty vast region, so we'll never be able to find and yeah, exactly, people experiencing homelessness, but also personally, I was quite worried about the stigmatizing component of, you know, looking for people experiencing homelessness and only through that lens of what we consider visibility. So rapidly, we kind of changed course a little bit. So it was very much a project that was inspired by participatory action research methods. We had an advisory committee made up of about 4 or 5 people in the region to guide the research and really help us even figure out how could we collect data that isn't readily available. So for instance, for researchers working in homelessness, you know, the readily available data is usually shelters, drop-in centers, or those kinds of community organizations that exist, maybe institutional resources as well. But when you're in a region that hasn't really developed homeless-oriented services, it's very hard to know how to build the data. So we began first at the suggestion of the committee by creating just a general survey, and we sent it out to all the organizations in the region, serving vulnerable people. That's kind of how we brought it forward, and asked them if they had been come into contact with, had served people experiencing homelessness. There were 24 organizations that responded. It was really a mix of community and institutional services that responded. For those not from Quebec, in Quebec we have quite a large community sector that is also that also forms the major response to homelessness in the province too. So that's something to take into consideration. So these first results from the survey weren't very conclusive. A lot of service providers didn't think they had been in touch with people that were experiencing homelessness. Perhaps it was also the way we brought it forward. So we had always wanted all along to have a qualitative element to go a bit deeper into what people knew and how they perceived homelessness. So survey wasn't very conclusive. We went forward with qualitative methods, and we did about 14 interviews one-on-one with key actors in the community, from community organizations, from charitable and volunteer services, from the public infrastructure, so hospitals, municipality, police services. And we conducted 3 focus groups with community organizations who consider themselves closer to the phenomenon of homelessness. And we also obviously wanted to do interviews with people with lived experience of homelessness. And this was definitely one of the biggest obstacles we encountered in this research. We only managed to conduct 3 interviews, despite the fact that we tried through various means to carry out these interviews. Next slide, please. So our findings really were initially kind of categorized along these themes, the strategies that people deployed to respond to their needs, and to also avoid the stigma of being perceived as experiencing homelessness. So shelter, food, hygiene and keeping clean, organizational abilities, and mobility. Next slide, please. So in response to the question, what does homelessness look like in our region? Finding shelter, obviously, was one of the first themes that kind of emerged. And the finding shelter piece, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody who's been working on homelessness, took many shapes, many different forms. So for instance, people used really a variety of strategies to find shelter that included couch surfing, the use of temporary or illegal housing, like squatting, using public places such as parks and bus shelters, and for some living in their vehicles once they lost housing, also living in non-functional RVs, recreational vehicles during the winter months, living in abandoned kind of shacks without heat, was mentioned quite frequently. The use of private commercial spaces such as marinas and private residential spaces, using citizens' lots, people that had an extensive amount of land, where they would squat in it, set up a tent or makeshift shelter. Sometimes boats were mentioned to make some kind of shelter. Obviously, the use of particularly private space and commercial space was quite contentious. Citizens would call the police, they would lodge public complaints with the municipalities, they would ask for people to remove from their property. So there was a lot of really conflictual cohabitation issues. And these forms of complaints and interventions actually produced data that we were trying to, data sets we were trying to figure out how to build. So we actually went to municipal records, police records, and in that way, we actually had pretty good access to see, okay, well, who is frequently coming into conflict with the law, who is frequently getting kind of turfed from these spaces. And in that way, we built our database to have a rough idea of how many people, combined with other data sets, were experiencing homelessness. So we put a few citations there. I'm not going to take the time to read them. I think you can all read them, but sometimes they're people who have experienced homelessness in the region, and sometimes they're from service providers. And by service providers, I put service provider very large because it's such a small community. I didn't want to kind of identify people, but service providers really ranged from community workers, what we call in Quebec, we have a very extensive travailleurs de rue, so people that are really kind of street workers, or travailleurs de rang, which are like the rural kind of street workers. So people that are really a part of the community. It's a very kind of grassroots approach that's very recognized here in Quebec. But there's also, for instance, police officers that participated in our study. So there's really a wide range of service providers. I'm saying way too much, so I have to move along. And the other thing that was mentioned in these forms of homelessness, just one sec, not quite the next slide, thank you. Yeah, so the fact that there weren't, as I mentioned in the beginning, typical homeless-oriented services we associate, like shelters and drop-ins, it meant that people really had to find creative ways to utilize what services were available in their areas. And just as a for instance, in terms of what I mentioned as illegal rental agreements, why I say illegal, it's because in the municipality in particular, there was quite a lot of regulation around housing, and the municipality really didn't want there to be necessarily an increase in kind of rental agreements. There was a lot of single dwelling homes. So there was also a lot of kind of nefarious practices when people rented out, say, a room in their house. There was experiences of people renting a room in a basement of someone's home, but they didn't have access to a kitchen, a bathroom, or washing facilities. They sometimes didn't even have a key to their room or to the house. So there was really not a lot of, well, there weren't really formal rental agreements. And of course, as we can imagine, this led people that were renting these rooms, they didn't really have any recourse if they were evicted or if the landlord changed their mind. And so there was a lot of kind of silent black market type practices that were occurring. And I think this is pretty common in a lot of regions like this. And just on a last note before we change the slide, all the participants really revealed, well, most of the participants except the advisory committee that were very concerned around homelessness, they didn't necessarily consider these experiences that we're describing here as akin to homelessness, because they really kind of felt there was a strong feeling that homelessness was really more of an urban phenomenon. And so they viewed these different situations as very temporary or transitional, as a person being very down on their luck, but they didn't really frame it within a homelessness discourse. Okay, next slide, thank you. I'm talking very fast, so I apologize for that. It's a bit my tendency. Another theme is the finding food theme, right? So how, when people are getting by, how do they get by? So finding food and or money to buy it was really a serious preoccupation brought forward by people with lived experience, but also service providers. Some local organizations did provide meals at certain times, but sometimes it was like twice a week. And people who were experiencing homelessness often felt very ashamed to go use these services, or they had to travel great distances in order to access them. So people mentioned really alternative means of nourishment, finding fruit in public gardens, so foraging, bartering worker objects in exchange for food, rummaging through the garbage bins of local restaurants, residents' homes, or local parks, but all the while attempting to remain unnoticed and often forcing contact with local authorities again. So there was kind of like a vicious cycle of invisibilization. And when we were there, we did hear that, you know, restaurant owners were asking police and the municipality to keep a closer eye on people that were in their garbage containers, that they didn't really want people going through there and getting what they needed. Next slide, please. Another theme that was mentioned was the keeping clean theme. So hygiene, sanitation, to basically go undetected and not be seen as a person experiencing homelessness. There's a lot of parallels here to be made with women's experiences of homelessness, I find, you know, who will kind of keep up a certain presentation so that they won't be seen as experiencing homelessness. So people went really to great lengths to not be associated with stereotypical images. One person who experienced homelessness stated it was important to essentially not look like a homeless person. And this meant that despite their precarious situation, they had to maintain an image of cleanliness, or they would risk being pushed out of private, public, and commercial spaces. So people use strategies like going to a friend's place to shower, which subsequently women reported as making them quite vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Using public places to get clean swimming pools, public toilets and shopping centers. But all of this required a lot of time and energy and required, you know, organization. And sadly, even during the course of our research, we heard that it was becoming more difficult for people to access these public facilities or the commercial facilities, because there was kind of a crackdown on inappropriate use of these facilities, and the municipality was implementing tighter access to public spaces, or they were implementing or considering implementing pay-for-service methods to exercise closer supervision. So there was a lot of intention behind also not making it possible for people to use these spaces. Next slide, please. Okay. So public transportation was also a really significant issue for people experiencing homelessness. Not a surprise. We're in vast regions, vast territories where it can take an hour, you know, to cut across the region in a car. So public transportation was really a significant factor. And this is kind of one of the paradoxes of homelessness. You know, many studies give the impression that situations are chronic, people are kind of stuck in these experiences. But in our research, we find that people are constantly on the move. They're constantly being pushed out or evicted or moved along. They're also not wanting to be picked up in the system, so they will kind of keep moving to avoid detection. So mobility and instability are kind of the hallmarks of homelessness, but we don't always see it as such. And we don't always recognize people's creativity and their organizational abilities in getting by, actually, in these situations. So like I said, mobility, transportation was a really big problem in the region because the few services that did exist, the few kind of community services and institutional services, were really few and far between. They were sprinkled across really sweeping territories. Public transportation was poorly developed. It was irregular. It did not stop between different villages. It offered bus routes that basically went towards the city or the cities and did not necessarily service the region by relaying the different communities, specifically the more northern parts or the more remote parts. There were a few charitable organizations that attempted to offer a service, a voluntary transportation service, to assist with getting to things like medical appointments, but it didn't really address other travel needs for those without a vehicle. And it was really, like I said, a charitable initiative. So I'm not sure about the perennity of such an initiative. So people reported walking very long distances or using a bicycle to gain access to services and hitchhike, but hitchhiking also sometimes led to being expelled from the region and being brought, say, to shelters in the city. And the other important part about the stability, instability, mobility part is that a lot of the participants talked about how people really wanted to stay in the region. You know, they really felt a sense of belonging, a deep sense of attachment to their community, despite sometimes, you know, feeling stigmatized or unwanted by people. I think the sense of belonging to place is a really important, um, a really important point for exploration, I think, in research. And I think we take it for granted, you know, we're so focused on kind of material conditions that we kind of forget the symbolic dimensions of lived experience. Next slide, please. So kind of cycling back a bit to our Quebec definition of homelessness, we definitely see, you know, in this project, but also in many other projects that we've carried out and are carrying out, that there's really an intertwining of individual and relational difficulties along with systemic, inadequacies or structural factors. So that form this kind of spiral of difficulties that make it very hard for people to, you know, get out of being in homeless situations, basically. So people reported a lot of family, couple conflict, people that often had, you know, experiences of being a child in child welfare, institutional care, addictions and mental health problems, moving quite a bit, multiple displacements, and very fragile social networks. So people would begin with, you know, couch surfing and relying on their close social networks, but pretty soon that would kind of just become too fragile and they would be asked to leave. And people also experienced in this region in particular, because part of the region is really quite a bedroom community in Montreal, when people did experience separation or divorce, it meant, you know, questions of affordability, not being able to afford two homes in a region where housing was fairly expensive, and risk of losing custody of children. So there was a whole kind of spiraling effect. And then combined with that, of course, is the lack of good social infrastructure. So, you know, inadequate, well, access to affordable housing for sure, inadequate social assistance, lack of specialized services as well for some people, like I'm thinking specialized mental health services that meant that people had to go to the city to have access to those kinds of services, or they chose to go without accessing services and stay in the region, which often made situations quite a bit worse. I think I'll keep going, please. Next slide. So in terms of our question, responding to the complexities of homelessness in the region where we were in, well, we did obviously note a lack of targeted community resources in the region to address homelessness. Several key actors mentioned the need to develop specific resources to support parents who were having difficulties with their children, especially adolescents, to prevent them from being pushed out of the house or pulled to the streets, pulled to the city. Participants mentioned that there was a lack of mental health supports, and yet there was a rise of mental health problems. So it was kind of the, you know, deterioration of situations, making people more and more vulnerable and maintaining them in states of homelessness. Access to affordable housing. There was actually a bit of affordable housing in the region, but almost all of it was destined for elderly people. So like I said, for people that were especially experiencing separation, divorce, death of a spouse, and that were middle-aged or younger age, there really wasn't much access to affordable housing. And this was really, really a big problem. And we know it's a problem really across the province. And like I said, the part of the region that was closer to the urban center was really pressured by gentrification processes. So really the housing market, and we know the housing market's just gotten worse, that we're having a big housing crisis here in Quebec, really makes it completely unattainable for people to access any kind of housing. And as I mentioned before, some stakeholders also mentioned that the municipality actively discouraged rental agreements and erected barriers in home ownership so that homeowners were forbidden from renting out rooms. However, it really produced an ironic turn because it kind of created an illegal market for housing and precarious tenancy arrangements. People really didn't have any recourse. And so they didn't have leases and they didn't have anything really in place to protect them. And there was also a significant lack of coordination and collaboration between existing services. That was really a big issue. For instance, there wasn't even, at the time, it was in development, but there wasn't like a community resource list. So community services didn't really know who was doing what, who had meals which day, who had access to food pantries, that kind of thing. And it was something that was highlighted in the action plan to be developed. So it was under development when we left. I'm just going to check my notes here. And again, as I said as well, organizations didn't necessarily recognize or feel that homelessness was an issue in the region. And they didn't realize that people that were experiencing homelessness were actually accessing their resources. So they didn't really reach out to other organizations to strategize around the phenomenon because they didn't actually realize it existed. So it kind of was a bit self-reinforcing in that way. Next slide, please. Don't worry, Dominic, I'm almost done. I know I'm saying a lot. So I think it's important to mention the political will piece because there was a lot of resistance to, and I'm sure that things have changed in 5 years as well, because in Quebec, we are actually developing action plans in each region around homelessness. So there is, I would say there's more political will. I think the political will, though, is situated more perhaps provincially than what's often found in the local municipalities. I think it's very context dependent. But I think it's important to mention that because there's also a lack of specific homeless-oriented services, there's no really clear organizational mandate about who, what should tackle homelessness. I do think that's changed over the last couple of years, though. And it often produced, situations that I mentioned about judicialization, so ticketing people, expelling people from properties, which led to really reinforcing the stigma people were experiencing and really individualizing the causes of homelessness, so not connecting it to the fact that affordable housing, any kind of mixed housing is available, things like that. And there was also, stakeholders mentioned that, there was also this idea that we want to keep this space, the region kind of pristine, we want to encourage families to come and settle here. We don't necessarily want to develop services specifically for people experiencing homelessness because we don't want to have that image. So that was also reported by actually several stakeholders that there was kind of wanting to protect the image of the community. So to purposely not develop services in that way would kind of protect that image. And that also kind of reinforced another element of the invisibility piece, because people didn't necessarily want to believe that there was homelessness that was occurring in their region. So despite the existence of some general community services and programs to help those in need, the lack of specific services targeted for the homeless meant that there was no institutional organizational mandate to provide services in the region. Combined with the lack of recognition about its very existence meant that specific services were not developed and the municipality could kind of maintain this image of, for lack of a better word, cleanliness, a great place for families to settle down, and that they didn't have these kind of urban problems regarding homelessness in the big city. Next slide, please. So we attempted to kind of provide to schematize, to provide a schema of how these kind of pieces fit together. No, sorry, the one before, the slide before, the one with the bubbles. There we go, thank you. So as I mentioned at the top of the modeling, it's like there's multiple strategies, there's multiple forms of homelessness in terms of shelter, food, how people get by. That are really reliant on people's creativity, organizational ability. In fact, sometimes we heard providers talk about how people experiencing homelessness, it was kind of an organized form of homelessness because they had to be organized in order to know what services were open, what was available, how to present in a certain way to not be considered homelessness as well, to not look in a certain way. And again, we talked about mobility and instabilities. Which also meant that it was difficult to maybe pick people up in the system because people were constantly on the move. Sometimes people went to the city to get a bit of help, so then they would come back because there was, like I said, this really strong sense of belonging. So it kind of fed into the lack of recognition because people were difficult to seize and figure out what was going on, producing forms of invisibilization. And then because it's so invisibilized, there's little social infrastructure to respond. So it kind of creates a vicious cycle that's self-reinforcing. And now I will pass it over to Dominique.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Suan. So my part will be a little bit more theoretical maybe, but because I will talk about stigmatization mostly, but I think it's really important to talk about it to well understand rural homelessness and all the issues surrounding it. So next slide, please. So while it is important to be able to target people experiencing homelessness in order to support and offer help, the identification of homelessness among individuals also bring a risk of sliding towards labeling and stigmatization. So in the aim to avoid the labeling and stereotypes associated with homelessness, people will use, like we said, multiple strategies like staying clean, sleeping in unsafe apartment, not to be seen as homeless person. In fact, stakeholders and all the person we met, they know that it is sometimes difficult to identify and approach people experiencing homelessness because some of them, they simply do not identify with this social category. And we have to keep in mind that living in insecurity on a daily basis is really ingrained in their habits. So many people, they do not consider themselves to be homeless. Like Suan said, they don't associate with the classic image of the hobo sleeping on a carton box and asking for money. And because they don't identify to this category or don't want to be identified, many of them won't access services like soup kitchens or shelter. And this is particularly true with youth experiencing homelessness or women, because to access services, we need to recognize ourselves in it and to have our identity not threatened by it. And most of the time, they don't identify to those resources. Next slide, please. So I spoke about the identity. We know that identity is built within social interaction, and when those interactions are negative, it has an effect on the confidence and ability to be socially integrated in society. So many participants report feeling ashamed of their situation and feeling not recognized as a human being. They don't feel as full citizen, namely because they have bad interaction with institutions, institutions like a hospital, police, municipality. So they really feel unwanted by all those institutions, but by the society too. The participants, they also argued that the stigma of being homeless in rural setting is so strong that often they will leave the region and seek shelter elsewhere, like in Montreal, for example. But they can also choose to stay in the region, but to make themselves invisible by sleeping and finding shelter in and out the way places to decrease their visibility. So the stigma they carry is kind of a mark of infamy, of disgrace. It's a stain caused by negative characterization. And according to the majority of the participants, the passage through homelessness has a significant effect on their identity, as they find it difficult to find a place in society, whether in the search of a job or an apartment, as a result of these experiences. So in this sense, we can say that the possession of a status that they perceived in a negative way in society can be correlative to the inequality of opportunity those people will have. So in other words, when the gaze of others is judgmental, isolation and withdrawal from society becomes often the only way to protect themselves. Thus, they can break from the institutions, services, and communities to avoid humiliation. And by doing so, by protecting their identity, their difficulties, they go undocumented and undetected. I just want to add that it is important to remember that the choice of withdrawing from society, it does not mean that they just disappear, of course. On the contrary, in order to protect their identity, they can try to associate with a group who will offer them recognition. So that group can be a criminal or a marginalized groups. Next slides, please. Homelessness, it's obviously not just about not having a roof, but it encompasses feeling of alienation and social disaffiliation. So a lived and embodied feeling of exclusion and marginalization. This embodiment was reflective of participants' meaning-making of the experience of homelessness. Like, for example, participants would describe the general meaning that inhabited their experience as ashamed, useless, unwanted. They felt that the feeling of nothingness, of unbelonging, dissuaded them of accessing services or asking for help, further reinforcing the invisibility. When we talk about invisibility, we refer to a process of social marginalization through a gradual erasure of the person's voice, existence, so the persons feel like nothing. Participants also described feeling like second-class citizens, so too ashamed to ask for help. They often choose not to access what little services were available, avoiding contact with the limited system and organization that were in place. And like we said, it reinforced their invisibility, so the public remained unaware of their existence. And that was also reflected with many service providers who only considers homelessness to be an urban phenomenon. So I know that those notions of visibility and invisibility, they may appear rather semantic, but they have very real consequences for marginalized people who are not seen and not heard, maintaining them in the marginalized space of society. Maintaining homelessness as invisible denies the existence of such experience. So if homelessness is not considered to be a social problem, it reinforces silence, it pushes those who are experiencing homelessness not to name their experience and difficulties, and it deresponsibilizes decision makers to propose solution or to take action. And we also, quickly, I'm going to talk about the concept of supravisibility, because our research also highlighted that some people are seen and viewed as problematic. Indeed, like some people who were homeless became super visible or supravisible to the point that overt practices of judicialization, like Suan said, like when they were going into garbage or they were finding shelter on the public space or being intoxicated, police would intervene, but the municipality too received a lot of complaints from the residents. Next slide, please. Okay. So the concept of visibility is closely bound with the notion of recognition. There is the theory that we call the theory for the struggle of recognition that has been developed by Annette, and it proposes three fundamental spheres of recognition. So we talked about love, law, and social solidarity that led to self-actualization, and those sphere of recognition, they can be actualized only through interaction with society. So to be recognized, to exist, we need to be in relation with others. Rural people experiences, their experience, they reflect a great lack of legitimacy, credibility, and a lack of understanding of their struggles, thereby producing an internalizing phenomenon of self-stigma, leading to a demobilization and a lack of interaction with service providers and other citizens. The lack of recognition of their needs and singularities on all three levels, so love, law, and social solidarity, produces shame and stigma, so encouraging, like Suan said, the vicious circle of non-recognition of their needs and existence. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, this research, it clearly shows that the lack of housing alone is not enough to describe the phenomenon of rural homelessness, which is rather the result of multiple and intersecting problems. As we have seen in the national description earlier, It is not only about not having a roof over our head, it is also about being visible in the society, not having a place. So basically it's a complex process of social disaffiliation and absence of housing. In our research, the member of our supervisory committee, they also developed a list of recommendations that should be taken up in future action plan. Just to name few, they said that it would be important to develop a common understanding of homelessness, of rural homelessness, namely, to raise awareness of it, to destigmatize the practice. And after that, they asked for the implementation of crisis center, of outreach activities also, and prevention approach to support the development of rural communities, and to develop appropriate local responses and capacity building within communities. And after that, there's all the resources for housing, transportation that are really important. So that was pretty much it. Suan, do you want to add something for the end?
No, that's great, Dominique. We put the link to the article there if you want to, if you'd like to read that. And, you know, all this research is really pre-COVID, and we know COVID's been a big game changer. So it seems almost crazy to do a presentation like this and not have some COVID data in there, but it wasn't the purpose for today. But we can imagine that all these situations with COVID would be much worse. And like I said, this project is a project from 2015, so it's a few years old now, but we have been involved in various projects, actually bigger projects across the province, but they're not published yet. So we haven't, I've, you know, picked up a few pieces here and there because I think they're interesting, but we haven't presented. Maybe in a future conference, Terry Lee, we can do more, because we put Quebec perspectives, but it's specifically about this region. But we made some links to other things we found, but we are at the end of a big project that was in every region of Quebec looking at hidden homelessness. So in the future, it'd be good to present that once I have the green light from the ministry and I'm allowed to.
Yeah, we'd love that. Yeah, we'd love that. I don't see any questions in there yet, but I would have some feedback and comments that might generate some questions. It's great to see stigmatization being addressed, I think, so comprehensively. I think that's a huge factor that's unique to rural communities. And I'm sure not completely unique. I'm sure urban centers feel the same, but I think in small communities, it's that whole sense of everybody knows everybody. And so it definitely pushes people out of sight and off the streets. So I know myself as someone who's done a lot of public speaking in rural communities about homelessness, that I always have somebody typically who says, I've never seen a homeless person in our community in all these years that I've lived here. So so understanding that is really important, I think, to actually having a dialogue about rural homelessness and what makes it different. Because I don't think rural homelessness is necessarily different in the sense that people still sleep outside, people still try to survive, people couch surf, and I think you do that in urban centers as well. But I think that stigmatization and invisibility piece is really important. And I think sometimes that invisibility piece was associated solely with couch surfing. Well, people just couch surf in rural communities. No, there's actually people sleeping rough outside in buildings and sheds and shacks and cars and RVs. And the reason why they do that is because they're trying to be not seen. They're actually intentionally trying to not be seen. So,
and if I agree with you. And if I can editorialize a little bit, that is one reason why I would put myself in this category. I'm pretty critical of point in time counts, because it really, point in time counts are really the visible forms of homelessness that we determine who's experiencing homelessness. I mean, we ask people, but it doesn't get it, for me, the more hidden components that you mentioned, the rural, the semi-rural, I mean, the way people get by, it's, the whole point is to not be seen, right? To not be detected, to not be viewed as somebody experiencing that. So I think we really have to question, some of these big national initiatives, but really whether it makes sense, for people's, to recognize the different forms of lived experience of that phenomenon. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dwayne just asked hi, Dwayne. Dwayne just asked a question. I'm always wondering how the lack of information of services and resources in rural mode is affecting the homeless. I think that's a good question. And I think you addressed that in your presentation a little bit in terms of the lack of coordination of services, lack of services, certainly as somebody who actually works frontline, as recently as last night, I was taking phone calls on Facebook Messenger till 11 o'clock at night about people who are homeless and what do we do and where do we go? And there literally is no one to refer them to after 4:30 half the time. There's like one resource in the entire county of 68,000 people. So, so it's definitely that lack of the lack of information and the lack of actual services is a huge factor in rural communities for sure.
And people don't seem to know what one another is doing, right? Like that really surprised me in this project. I mean, they were in the midst of developing a community resource list, but everybody's kind of, tunnel vision, doing their own thing. It doesn't realize what's happening, 50 kilometers down the road, what kinds of, so how are you directing people to services if you don't actually know what's going on in your community? I think that's probably changed quite a bit since our time, but just access to information, like just coordinating the information is a huge piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The way to present the information, because many like participants experiencing homelessness and stakeholder as well, when services were presented to people, they would say, no, I'm not homelessness. I don't need like to go into a soup kitchen, or I don't need a shelter. I don't need those services. What I need is something else. We don't know exactly what is this something else, but the way services are presented may not fit the way people see themselves also.
Yeah, so Jane has a really good question here too. Was this in a community that was mostly settlers? Also wondering, how can we ensure that lived experience leadership takes place within communities if people aren't identifying with homelessness as a term?
Yeah, so two really good questions in there. They were mostly settler communities, and I should have maybe mentioned that in the beginning. They're kind of two, et Dominique, corrige-moi si je me trompe, but there was like 2 or 3 Indigenous reserves around, but they didn't really, I mean, this is, as Jane knows, because she's in Montreal too, this is really a problem we have in Quebec, is that people don't dialogue with enough with the Indigenous communities that are around. And that was definitely, I think, a problem in our project. So yes, it was definitely more of certainly also, I'd say, a white Quebec de souche perspective. And the second question was what again? I got to look it up. Sorry.
Lived experience and how we build leadership.
Yeah, well, totally. I mean, we had such a problem just even recruiting people to talk to us about their experiences of experiencing homelessness in the region. And some of them, Dominique, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think some of the people that we did agree to participate in the research were actually from off-territory shelters that we said, did you experience this in Montérégie? Is that how we did it?
Yeah, we went pretty far to meet with people, and they were outside the region, but they experienced it in the region. We also went to Montreal. Actually, we with a shelter for youth to talk to them because they were the only shelter. They were the closest shelter from Montérégie, so they were the only one having youth from Montérégie. So we had to go pretty much like everywhere around Montérégie to be able to document the phenomenon.
Yeah, it was a problem finding people, even though we used our local network and we had an advisory committee that put us in touch with people. It was definitely the hardest part of recruitment for the project. But I think it really speaks volumes about the fact that people don't want to be identified like that, and don't identify also maybe their experiences like that. It's kind of a bit of both. It's kind of the conscious and the unconscious. I think that people don't recognize, even the service providers, they're serving very vulnerable people, living very vulnerable experiences, but they just don't identify it with that lens. They don't use those words. So it becomes self-reinforcing in the end. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question.
We in Leonard County, with Cornerstone Lenny, we had a few instances where young people shared their stories and they were completely attacked on social media by the local community members because they knew about these kids since they were born and what community they came from, what their family was about and what they did. And so it was not a pleasant experience for those young people to share their stories. And we've been really reluctant to kind of put kids in that position again. It's a very different experience in rural communities when everybody knows everybody. We actually had a young person share a story one time about just their last name too, that they don't even want to identify with their last name because their last name has a reputation in a community. That's very different than if you were in a city, right? So, sorry, I missed a question up here. And I think, Rebecca, you have your hand up, I think too, but Faye has a question too. I like Dominique's idea about love, loss, social stability as a human need, very parallel to the definition of social inclusion, the reality and feeling of belonging and the necessity to have that be basic to how services are conceptualized. Yeah, it's true.
Terry Leah, can I jump in with my
Of
couple
course.
of comments and question? Anyway, first of all, thanks Sue-Ann and Dominique for your presentation. It's really interesting and really interesting to hear research out of Quebec. I feel like I'm often disconnected from it, and so that was great. But I was going to say, just to actually in response to one thing that Terry Lee just said about people's names and knowing people's names, and while I know that's true in smaller rural communities, it happens in urban communities too. And people are always telling me that in Regina, like, oh, I say my name. And especially if it was an Indigenous sounding last name, you know, that like the landlord would hang up on them like, oh, I don't have that unit available anymore, you know, so that definitely happens. But it can be more like that people hear an Indigenous sounding name, like that kind of racist element to it. And the other thing I was going to say, was about thinking about this myth that homelessness doesn't exist in rural areas, and that rural areas continue to they even perpetuate that myth within their own communities. And it kind of reminded me of something I talked with Terry Lee about this a lot, or I've been telling her about it a lot. I try and do this data off the side of my desk looking at point in time counts, which I also agree, I don't like point in time counts necessarily either. I'm not sure they work very well for rural areas, but taking some data that I can find from rural areas on how many homeless people there are and comparing that to what I can find in urban areas. And Alberta's actually great for that because they've done a lot of stuff and used similar methodologies across different communities. And what I found is like the rates of homelessness are higher in rural areas than they are in urban areas. And this is just very like, I haven't put it all together yet, but that's kind of what I've been finding. And I did some stuff a few weeks ago for an interview I was giving for some media thing. And I was finding that there was, for every, I think it was in Calgary, there was one person was homeless for every 1,000 residents. And in a comparable rural area, I think it was like High Level or something, it was 2 people were homeless for every 1,000 residents. And it's not, I mean, the absolute numbers aren't as large, so that because the rural areas are smaller, but I think that's interesting that we have this perception that it doesn't exist, or it exists on very, you know, it's very minimal if it does, but the rates, if you look at them, are actually seem to be higher in some areas than they are in urban areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And sorry, Terry Lee, I cut you off. And there isn't necessarily as well in rural areas, the social infrastructure isn't the same, right? So there isn't, you know, blocks of social housing and things like that. It's not, or there are, but they're few. There aren't rooming houses necessarily that we see in cities that is kind of like easy access housing for people. I mean, there's all kinds of differences. So we don't recognize that it is just as current, or what you found is even more prevalent, but yet we don't develop at all the same responses either, you know? And I think there's also kind of a pride. I mean, I know I'm from a rural area way back, and, you know, it's kind of a pride that people rely on their community. You know, you pull up your bootstraps, there's kind of also like a whole kind of ideology that goes with rural living, that we want people to be very independent and autonomous and rely on their local community. But what happens when, you know, in the experiences you mentioned, like local community rejects you, right? You're seen as the problematic figure in that community. Anyway, it's yeah, problematic.
Yeah. Dwayne, you had asked about aging into care, and then also jails too, and how that affects rural and remote homeless communities. So when people are discharged or who age out of care, how does that affect rural communities too? Was there anything covered on that in your research?
Well, not in this particular project, but in the project we just finished. It's a lot of around hidden homelessness, but tipping points from institutional. So institutional, not just prisons, youth centers, child welfare, hospitals, rehabilitation. Forgetting something in there, but basically the 4 kind of big institutions here, we actually did interview people and around those tipping points and kind of, yeah, the things that are not put in place. In fact, homelessness just basically isn't on the radar in public institutions, and people aren't thinking to ask these questions about their residential stability after, you know. So that's, I mean, I would like to present on that in a few months once we've kind of gone public, but that's just a big, and I know it's not unique to Quebec, but it's a very big problem we have here, that we don't have enough psychosocial supports around people, or peer supports, or any kind of supports to plan for reentry, you know, and homelessness is not on people's radar. They're just not thinking to ask those questions about people's residential situations. So we're not preparing people well, and we're not accompanying them well either in those exits.
Jesse Jenkinson said, thank you so much. As someone that focuses on urban homelessness, this is insightful, and there are many overlaps while also clear contextual differences. And Faye also commented, it's difficult to attach a name to a human condition like homelessness when there is no resolution in sight or in a plan. Another version of spiraling municipalities avoiding the possibility of obligation. It's true. Yeah,
it's true. I mean, I think in homelessness, we talk so much about people's material conditions, but we really forget the symbolic pieces that are so representative of how also people get by, the options they have, the choices they have to make too. Like, we just kind of forget about the really subjective pieces that, you know, I'm not saying material elements aren't important. Of course they are. You know, you need shelter, you need to eat, but it's also how all those lack of material conditions as well really deteriorate your ability to be seen as a citizen in society, and to have, you know, access to services, and to, you know, have your rights respected, to be treated fairly, humanely, with respect, with dignity. So yeah, it's a big problem. For me, we don't talk about it enough, in fact.
Yeah, most of the time people, they don't talk about what's missing, like what object are missing in our life, but they're missing relationship. And they talk mostly about how they feel, or how they feel about being treated like that, or they feel about not being able to be in relationship or to get services from hospital or whatever services they need. So it's mostly about, I think it's really relational what they're missing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, you know, the treatment also in institutions, I mean, you know, we do not have good track records for treating people with respect and dignity, you know, human beings. Once you know, are identified as being somebody experiencing homelessness, I mean, participants, like people with lived experience and service providers, will say people are not treated with the same consideration, the same respect. Yeah, it's a problem, big problem. So
Yeah.
Stigma and discrimination is, and then, you know, if you add on different, you know, social categories, racial categories, it just, we don't create equitable ways for people to integrate socially, to be included.
Yeah. Rebecca just said goodbye to everybody, by the way, but it is after 1 now, so maybe we'll wrap it up there. Just to give people a heads up, we do record these and we do post the links to the recordings on our website, and we're going to try to post the presentation as well. So there's going to be a link up there for that too. So don't hesitate to send that out, or send it to colleagues if they're interested. And a big thank you to both of you again. I think, you know, from an advocate who's trying to get resources and money into the hands of rural communities, I don't think you researchers sometimes understand how important the work is that you do. And I know sometimes there's a bit of a backlash to research. Oh, we got too much research, we know this is a problem. We don't have enough research on rural and remote homelessness. So thank you for taking up the cause, because I think it's really valuable for us advocates in trying to advocate for tangible long-term changes for rural communities. So and thank you to the participants who came, and look for our next ones. I just want to say, mention 2 other names too. Shane Pelletier is my co-chair, who wasn't able to make it today. He's been working hard, worked 2 jobs for a while, so he's hopefully going to jump back on and start co-hosting these with me again. And then also just a shout out to Dr. Nick Falvo. Nick was actually the one who sent me the link to your research, your article. So he's a member of our steering committee as well, but sends us links to information and research when it comes up. So so thanks to Nick as well. So stay safe, everyone. Take care.
Thanks everybody for attending. It was a nice small number, so it was very cozy. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Michelle too for your help.